This project is going to be a scarf. I measured a piece of yarn the length I need and tied it from the dowel to the loom. I have my balls of yarn laid on the floor beneath the loom. I tied the red yarn onto the rod at the back of the loom. The red yarn isn't going to be part of the scarf. I just like to use it to keep the back rod in place while I wind the warp onto the loom. I take the yarn and double it so that 2 strands are passing through the heddle. Then I put the doubled strand through the heddle slot. The tool I'm using is called a sleigh hook. I walk down to the dowel and loop the strands over it. When I return to the loom, I'll pull the next doubled strand through the adjacent heddle slot. Then go down and loop the yarn around the dowel. The scarf will have stripes, so it's time to change the color. Notice that I'm only placing the yarn through the slots and not the holes in the heddle. The yarn will be placed through the holes later on, after I'm finished putting the yarn onto the loom. Now that I've come to the center of the rod, I don't need the red yarn holding it in place anymore. The yarn is tied in a knot, and it's time to wind it on the loom. We call the yarn wound onto the loom the warp. I hold the warp tightly in one hand, so the yarn is under tension while I wind it onto the loom. Paper is placed on top of the yarn as it is wound onto the back beam. This keeps the yarn in order and the warp neat and tidy. I tied my lucky clover shoelace around the rigid heddle and the back beam of the loom. This will hold the heddle in place while I work with the yarn. Every slot has 2 strands of yarn, and the holes don't have any yet. So I'm pulling one of the strands through the hole in the adjacent slot. Now I'm tying the warp to the front rod. It's important to keep the tension even when tying the warp yarn to the front. This is easier if you start in the center and tie subsequent knots alternately on each side. A long strip of fabric is woven in at the beginning to serve as a filler before weaving the scarf. After the woven piece is taken off the loom, the fabric strip will be taken out, leaving extra warp yarn for the fringe of the scarf. The weft yarn is the yarn that you weave back and forth. I don't want any of the weft yarn hanging off on the sides, so I wove the end back into the piece. I'm splicing the yarn so it will lay in without being noticed. I'll cut the hanging ends off later.
I explain all kinds of looms, from simple to complex, in my course, Introduction to Weaving. For more information on the course, the link is in the description. If you'd like to learn more about weaving, subscribe to my channel. And check out my website, The Creativity Patch. There's lots more to learn there, and I've got fun weaving kits too. Happy weaving!